People will say, if you would just not talk about racism, racism would go away. It's people like you, meaning people like me, who keep racism alive by insisting on discussing it. Yes, of course, because we all know that social problems are the result of conversations about social problems. We all know that, right? Like if I were going to give a talk about world hunger, I'm sure you would all agree that I probably shouldn't do that, because if I open my mouth and tell you that there are billions of children on this planet starving from lack of nutrition, that I probably ought not say it, because if I say it, that's why they will starve, right? And if I would just be quiet, if I would just be silent, that somehow food would miraculously appear on their plates. To blame the conversation for the problem is like blaming your speedometer for your speeding ticket, right? The speedometer didn't cause you to go 80 in a 65. All it did was tell you what you've done, right? It's just a way of transmitting information. That's all that a conversation about race is. It can't be blamed for the problem of racism.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another edition of the CMC Show. I'm your host, Anthony Stewart. Here we discuss black culture, politics, sports and entertainment. I ran across this video. Tim Wise, he's a professor, and he is giving a lecture on racism in America. This, in my opinion, has to be one of the most succinct lectures that I've come across on this topic, because he wastes no real estate. It's like a good action movie. He's one punch after the next. He's tackling one issue after the next, complete with some analogies or some examples. And just listen, white people, just listen for a change, and just try to understand. The video, it might seem like it's long if you look at the minutes, but it goes fast because, like I said, it's like an action movie. He's one after the next. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get back into the video and play the rest of it. And Tim Wise, everybody.
You're not under any obligation to agree with the things that I say. The only thing you have to do is listen and then commit to thinking about some of the things that I say, and then having this conversation and continuing this dialogue with the folks on this campus who I have no doubt, both faculty, staff, administrators, and students, have been wanting and desiring this conversation and real traction around issues of racial equity for a long time. And those folks are disproportionately people of color to whom we need to learn to listen, and whose lead we need, those of us called white, to follow when it comes to creating racial equity. So I hope that the next time there is a program on this campus in which not a white man, but a person of color is above you on this podium speaking, that you will be here just as readily as you are this evening, because only then will we really know that we're making progress as a society. When a person of color can get up and say all of the things that I'm about to say in the next hour, and be taken as seriously as I expect to be, and get the amazing applause that I'm totally going to get when I'm done, because this is going to be really great. Or now, whatever, that's great too. So here's the thing, the reason I'm really glad you're here is that a lot of times when we have discussions about race on campus, and I've been doing this work for a long time, been doing anti-racism and civil rights work for 25 years, I've been doing it on the lecture circuit for 21 of those. And a lot of times people don't come to these events because they are under the impression, and they have every reason to be, they've been encouraged to think that we don't have to have this conversation anymore, that we've attained some level of post-raciality as a society, and so this conversation is passé, this conversation is tired, we don't have to talk about race, and we know this because having a man of color as president for the last roughly 8 years proves that we can't really have a problem with racism. Of course, if we were to think about that for just a second, and we were to ask if that were true for gender, so if I were to say, for instance, does it mean that there is no sexism in England because Margaret Thatcher was the head of state there? Or if I were to say that there is no patriarchy in Pakistan because a woman, Benazir Bhutto, was elected there not once but twice. Now, she has been assassinated since, so it lets you know how much some folks loved her, but if I were to suggest that there was no sexism, no patriarchy, no rape culture in any of the many nations where women have been heads of state, in Ireland, in Israel, in India, Great Britain, the Philippines, Pakistan, Germany right now, I think every woman in the room at the very least would know that I'd lost my mind. Right? I don't think there are any women in this room who plan on packing your bags and moving to Karachi tomorrow just because Benazir Bhutto was the head of state, because we understand that just because a woman can attain the pinnacle of political leadership doesn't mean that millions of other women do not face sexism. Individual accomplishment doesn't tell us anything in and of itself about systemic, structural, institutional, society-wide truth. But when it comes to race, we apparently believe it does in this country. So the presence of a man of color in the head of political leadership, we are to believe and we are told, means that we don't have to have this conversation. Or we're told that it's not that we don't have to have it, it's just that having it makes things worse. You'll hear that. People will say, if you would just not talk about racism, racism would go away. It's people like you, meaning people like me, who keep racism alive by insisting on discussing it. Yes, of course, because we all know that social problems are the result of conversations about social problems. We all know that, right? Like if I were going to give a talk about world hunger, I'm sure you would all agree that I probably shouldn't do that, because if I open my mouth and tell you that there are billions of children on this planet starving from lack of nutrition, that I probably ought not say it, because if I say it, that's why they will starve, right? And if I would just be quiet, if I would just be silent, that somehow food would miraculously appear on their plates. To blame the conversation for the problem is like blaming your speedometer for your speeding ticket. Right? The speedometer didn't cause you to go 80 in a 65. All it did was tell you what you've done, right? It's just a way of transmitting information. That's all that a conversation about race is. It can't be blamed for the problem of racism. There wouldn't be a need for the conversation were the problem of racism not in existence. The same is true with any other social problem. So we have to move past this idea that the more we talk about it, the worse it gets, because there's no other problem about which we would say that with a straight face. Now, having said that, I don't want to suggest that any conversation will do. Just because we have to have a discussion about these issues doesn't mean that it's irrelevant how we talk about it. There are better and worse ways of addressing the issue of race and racism. And I want to suggest to you that by and large, our problem stems, I think, from three large issues or barriers to effective dialogue, things that keep us from having the kind of discussion that we really need to have. Maybe four if I have time, but three for sure. The first is that, for the most part, we steadfastly refuse to accept that we ourselves harbor racial bias. In other words, we take this view that we have attained this pinnacle of colorblindness, that we do not see or think about race, that yes, there may be other people out there who are racist, but not me. My Uncle Jim, he's an asshole, but not me, you see. I don't have any of that bias. I have black friends. I dated an Asian woman once. I have a dream catcher in my rear view mirror, and now I have come to the conclusion that my great-great-grandmother was a Cherokee princess. I can't possibly have any racism in me. That's somebody else's problem, not mine. So our inability to see ourselves as racially biased makes it very difficult to have an honest conversation, because we spend so much time trying to divide ourselves into the good people who are not racist and the bad people who are racist, that we miss the fact that we're all being programmed and conditioned in racist ways every day. So I'll have more to say about that in a second. But the second problem that keeps us from having real dialogue and making progress and taking action after the dialogue is that even when we are willing to acknowledge personal bias, we don't see the systemic problem. So we might be willing to attack the individual racist who does something on a college campus. We might be willing, for instance, to punish the women on the softball team here at Stetson in 2005 who did whatever it was they did. I've forgotten now what had happened, but we can punish them, we can make them read my book, we could theoretically kick them off campus, we could do whatever, right? But that doesn't necessarily get at the systemic and the institutional, the structural problem. So I want us to talk about the difference, right, between the individual and personal on the one hand and the structural and the institutional on the other. So we'll talk more about that. The third thing, and this is big, and I'll spend the bulk of my time on this, is that we refuse to acknowledge the way that history affects where we are today. the way that the past affects the present. We have this incredibly ahistorical view, right? That the past is the past and it doesn't matter. The present is now, the future is then. It's a very linear thing, right? What happens in one generation apparently doesn't affect the next in our mind, and we don't want to talk about the history of racism in our country, even though, unless you understand that history, you cannot understand anything that you see today with regard to racial disparities in this country. It is impossible to understand everything from where people live and where they don't unless you understand that history. It is impossible to understand disparities in wealth or income or educational outcomes unless you understand that history. It is absolutely impossible to understand why police are 21 times more likely to kill young black men than young white men, 2 to 3 times more likely to do so even when those men are unarmed, unless you understand the history of law enforcement, policing, and how we got to this space. It is impossible to understand the current drama concerning the issue of immigration unless you understand our history, and particularly how we have misremembered it. It isn't just a matter of how the past affects the present, it's how we remember the past or misremember it also affects the present. And I'll have a lot to say about that. And if I have time, there will be one more, but I won't tell you what it is yet because I may not have time, and we may just have to save that for a different day. So let's talk about these one at a time. First, the individual piece, right? This idea that, yes, there's racism, but not me. I, as the saying goes, don't have a racist bone in my body. I have all those black friends. This is something that African American folk are intimately familiar with, this line that we as white folks use. Oh, I've got black friends, so I can't possibly be racist. First of all, usually, let's just be honest, when we say we have black friends, we are usually lying. I'm just wanting to be honest and truthfully. I'm not saying that sometimes we're not telling the truth, but most of the time we're not. How do I know that? Very simple, because a few years ago there was a survey that was taken where they found that 75% of white Americans, which that year was 142 million white people, said that we had many black friends. Now I want you to think about that. When you say many, you just told me what you meant. See, I know what many means. If you wanted to tell me that you had one black friend, which I might have believed, you would have said a, not many. If you wanted to tell me that you had 2 black friends, which, all right, maybe, you would have said a couple, not many. If you wanted to tell me you had 3 black friends, which now I'm really starting to think you might be lying, you would have said a few. So when you say you have many, you just said you had 4 or more black friends each. Keep in mind the numbers, 142 million white people who said that they had 4 or more black friends each, and there were only 35 million black people to go around that year. Half of whom said they didn't even have one white friend. So actually, there weren't even 35 million black folk for us to hang out with and play with and party with. It was like 17.5 million black people to go around for 142 million white people. I wasn't good at math, but I'm seeing a problem between the numerator and the denominator, as the saying goes, right? I'm not saying that we might not be friendly with people of color, but there's a difference between being friendly, talking to folks in the res hall, talking to folks when you see them on campus or around the water cooler at work, and actually being friends. But more importantly, even if every one of us was telling the truth, it wouldn't matter, would it? What does having friends of color have to do with whether or not you might be racially biased? See, we act like somehow that's a get out of jail free card, that we can't be racist if we have black friends. Think about the logic of that. If that were true, then heterosexual straight men could never be sexist, because our ultimate defense would be what? I love women. I date women. I married me a woman. I can't be sexist. I sleep with women. How can I be sexist? The only sexist men are gay men by that logic, which makes no damn sense at all. Right? And we would recognize the idea that the women in this room think that they're like no sexist heterosexual men. I doubt that any of you would nod in agreement with that, but that's sort of the logical analogy from some of my best friends are black or Latino or I dated an Asian woman or whatever. None of that matters, right? It sort of misses the point that one can have personal bias even if one has personal closeness to people from a different group, because what you can do is carve out an exception for those handful that you like and still hold on to biases about the larger group. There was actually a survey that was done right before the 2008 presidential election where it was found that something like 40% of white Democrats, right, when they were polled, said, yeah, they were going to vote for President Obama, there were 40% who said yes, they were going to vote for him, but that they still held on to very serious racial stereotypes about the larger black community. So they had created an exception, for Barack Obama, but the way that they viewed the larger community of black folks was still negative. So is that racism or not? I would say it's a 2.0 version, 3.0 version, but it's still a form of bias. So the idea that we're not personally biased just because of our connection to people of color doesn't really wash. But more importantly, we know from the research that it just isn't true, right? That in fact, the overwhelming majority of us have been conditioned to harbor racial biases, and as a result, we do so. The overwhelming data suggests that most all of us have, to some extent or another, internalized certain negative stereotypical biases against black folks, against Latino folk, against Muslims in a post-9/11 environment, against poor people of all races and ethnicities, against women as women, regardless of class or race, against LGBTQ folks, against disabled people, right? Any time that a group is marginalized, there comes certain stigmas and stereotypes, and we're all familiar with them. And not only are we familiar with them, the research says overwhelmingly we actually have internalized them. In fact, the research says that about 45% of black folks, nearly half, have actually internalized negative biases against other black folks. So it isn't just white folks who get conditioned. Even the one who's the target of the stereotype is vulnerable to internalizing it. So there was this study a few years back, just to give you an example of what I mean, where they took these nice white liberal people who didn't have any overt racism so far as anybody could tell, and they hooked them up in a lab setting to these brain scan monitoring machines, right? So they put the electrodes on the head and they're monitoring the brain scan images, right? And they start to flash images on a computer screen in front of the subjects who were taking this test. Keep in mind, none of these people are overt racist. None of them are Klansmen. They're not white supremacists or skinheads, right? They're sitting in front of a screen and they're being shown images. And the images are being flashed so quickly that their brain can't even consciously know what it saw, right? So it's like 85 milliseconds or something. This is stuff that they used to do back in the 50s in movie theaters. They would actually do this, right? They would put these subliminal messages on the screen. They'd go into the film and they'd insert the word popcorn on the film, right? So you're sitting there watching the film and all of a sudden you're like, damn, I need some popcorn. You don't even know where that came from. It's a subliminal message. They just flash it really quick. Your conscious mind doesn't know. They stopped doing that in the movies, I think, right? But how would I know? I have no idea. Maybe they're still doing it. I don't know. But what I do know is that in this particular case, they're flashing these images for 85 milliseconds, and most of the images were sort of meaningless, like a beach ball, a bunny rabbit, a blade of grass, a tree, whatever. And there wasn't a whole lot of activity on the brain scan, right? Not a lot was going on. But then they flashed an image of a black male face for 85 milliseconds. Once again, your conscious brain doesn't even know what it saw or that it even saw anything, but subconsciously your brain is responding. What happened? Well, that part of the brain that responds to anxiety and fear lit up like a Christmas tree, right? That part that tries to regulate after you're afraid of something, it's called executive function. So when you have an irrational response that you're trying to control, it lights up because you're trying to get a control of your emotions. The point being, you only had to get control of your emotions because there was some kind of a fear response in the first place, and this was among nice white liberal people without any overt racism at all. What does it mean that even people with no overt bias could still have a type of subconscious priming that allows them to respond that way? And that was in a nice, comfortable lab, man. They're sitting there with bottles of water and air conditioning, sitting in a nice, cushy chair. What do you think that might imply for law enforcement on the street when they encounter folks of color in situations that are not nearly that comfortable and that easy? What might it mean for a teacher in a classroom when they're interacting with students in a situation that might be stressful and how they respond to that child? See, what this tells us is that we can be conditioned to have these responses even though we don't even know we have them, right? Because why? Advertising works. Advertising works. What do I mean by that? Think about a couple weeks ago, Super Bowl, right? These companies spend hundreds of millions of dollars to sell you a bunch of stuff, right? So they're trying to sell you Sprint plan. They're trying to sell you certain types of toilet paper, toothpaste, beer, Diet Coke, whatever the hell Drake was trying to sell, right? We're selling you all this stuff, and these companies spend like $100 million. I think that was the Sprint ad, was Drake, right? $100 million or more to try to take out these ads and sell you consumer products. Why? Because they understand that the more you see their ad, the better odds are that you will buy their junk, right? And that happens. We know actually in the world of marketing, there is a theory called the Rule of 12, right? And what the Rule of 12 says is that when you've seen an ad a dozen times, that's the moment where you're exponentially more likely to go buy the product, right? So like the first couple times you see it, you're like, sometimes if you're like me, you look at the ad, you're like, what the hell was that? I don't even know what that was an ad for. Like, these people are stupid. I'm not going to buy there. I don't even know what the hell it was. These people are idiots. Oh, you think they're idiots? They just spent millions of dollars. You think they're just throwing money away? No, they know what they're doing. They give you a vague, innocuous ad the first few times, because then you'll be the fifth time, sixth time, you'll be like, I got to pay attention to that shit. That was crazy the first 4 times. Now all of a sudden you're looking at it, you're like, oh, Taco Bell Crunch Wrap. Breakfast Crunch Wrap, right? And at first you're still like, that's ridiculous. Why would I want a taco wrapped up like a burrito with the egg and a piece of sausage in it at 6 o'clock in the damn morning? Why do I need that? Nobody ever wanted that. Reverse the clock 5 years before they had that. You think anybody was lobbying for a breakfast crunch wrap at 6 in the morning? Any of y'all write a letter to Taco Bell like, you know what we need at 6 a.m. is a taco wrapped up like a burrito with an egg and a piece of sausage in it. Nobody was asking for that, but some genius at Taco Bell was like, watch this. And he creates the product, or she does. They create an ad campaign for it. Now you got folks around the block. They're like, I'm not eating Egg McMuffins anymore. Screw Egg McMuffins. I'm all about a breakfast crunch wrap. And they sold you on it because you saw the ad 10 times, 20 times, 30 times, and then folks started trying it. Now, if that can work with Taco Bell, it can work with toilet paper, toothpaste, tennis shoes, cell phones, candy, right? Think about how much easier it is to sell you on a racial stereotype, because you've seen that ad, metaphorically speaking, more than just 12 times, right? We've been exposed to those stereotypes way more than 12 times by the time we're young adults. We've been exposed to that stuff all of our lives, and it takes root in us whether we want to acknowledge it or not. And if we don't acknowledge it, see, it's very hard for us to move forward because we're so busy saying, you're a racist, but I'm not. You're prejudiced, but I'm not. You've got bias, but I don't, that we can't even see ourselves in the work. But let me tell you something. This thing can affect everyone, even no matter how progressive you think you are, no matter what kind of progressive home that you were raised in. And I know this from personal experience because I've seen it in my own children. My wife and I have 2 daughters. They're 14 and 12. But when they were 7 and 5, one Sunday afternoon, we're sitting around, and it's raining out, right? Can't really go to the park. So we're looking for a TV, looking for a movie to watch on the cable satellite deal or whatever, right? So we're flipping around the on-demand Comcast thing and looking at trailers, looking at commercials for different movies. And we come across the trailer for the movie Evan Almighty. If y'all remember that, it was a comedy where Steve Carell plays a congressman and Morgan Freeman plays God, and Morgan Freeman tells Steve Carell that a big flood is coming and he should build an ark like Noah and ride it out. You know, it's sort of cute. It's like the modern retelling of the Noah and the ark story, I guess. You know? And as it turns out, my wife and 2 daughters had already seen the film at the theater, so they didn't necessarily want to watch it again that Sunday, but because they had seen it, they recognized the actors on the trailer and they recognized some of the dialogue, right? So it got their attention. And the youngest of my daughters at that time, Rachel, right, she's 5 years old, she looks up and she does what any 5-year-old would do. She says, Daddy, is that God? Pointing at Morgan Freeman, right? In the flowing white robes in the role of God. And I thought that was sort of cute because that's exactly what you would say at 5, right? I mean, like when you're 5, you don't know anything about the Screen Actors Guild or like casting directors, right? You just figure maybe God wanted to make a movie. And if God wanted to make a movie, odds are God could get the movie made. Like, it wouldn't be hard for God. Now, one would hope that he would make a movie that, got better than 23% on Rotten Tomatoes, but at least in theory, this could get done. So my 5-year-old asked the question. I sort of laugh at it. I'm like, no, Rachel, no, that's not God. That's just an actor. That's Morgan Freeman. He plays God often. He'll probably be in this role again. He sort of gets it over and over and over. But it's just an actor playing a part. And she's like, oh, okay, good. Cool. And I thought the conversation was over with, right? But it wasn't. Because then the 7-year-old, Ashton, looks up. Now she's interested in this conversation. She looks up. She sees Morgan Freeman in the role of God, looks at her sister, starts to laugh, and she goes, Rachel, that can't be God. And I knew in that moment two things, as surely as I knew my own name, right? One was that I was going to have to ask her why not. And secondly, I already knew what her answer was going to be before I ever asked her the question. But I knew I had to ask it. Now, I was hoping for some help from my wife. So I looked to the left where she was sitting, and I got nothing at all, except the look that was like, yeah, smartass, this would be your area of expertise. I really got nothing for you. I might take some pictures and scrapbook this precious moment, but beyond that, I got nothing. So I knew it was on me. I looked back at my daughter and I asked her the question. I said, why? Why can't that be God? And in the moment before she answered, I had this fantasy, this really brief like blip of a fantasy in my brain where she was going to give me a really great answer. Not the one I'm expecting, but one that I'm hoping for, like, well, Daddy, that can't be God because God is a woman. That would have been cool. That's not what she says. I'm also thinking maybe she'll say something like really deep and philosophical, like some existentialist answer like, oh, Father, what is God anyway? But she was 7, so she didn't give me that. Instead, she gives me exactly what I knew she would. She says, that can't be God because God isn't black, God is white. Now, please know this, and it probably won't surprise you to learn if you didn't already know, we don't have any racialized images of a deity in our home. We don't have any images of a deity at all in our home, but certainly no racialized images of a God, right? We never allowed those awful, one might say god-awful if one was intended to giving puns, and right, those god-awful children's Bible books that permeate the South. If you're from the South like I am, they have them in every damn pediatrician's office, right? The blue books, the Bible series, because, that's what you need when you get your booster shot is a little God talk. That's really important, So they have these god-awful blue children's Bible stories, the ones that make Adam and Eve look like they were in the Garden of Sweden, right? Right? Adam looks like Justin Bieber. I mean like old school with the bob Justin Bieber, not like ripped and tattooed Justin Bieber. I mean like old school Justin Bieber. It's absurd, right? The idea that the first human beings look like that, right? Obviously absurd. There's God, right, in the clouds, Santa in the sky, white dude. All the biblical characters in the Bible, children's books, white people, even though they were in a part of the world where there are no white people, right? So even though we don't have that in our home, my child has nonetheless already at the age of 7 somehow internalized the idea that the creation source of the universe, whether taken in religious terms or humanistic and more naturalistic terms, is somehow closer to her than to Morgan Freeman. And if my daughter has internalized that, what do you think black and brown children internalize when they see the same imagery? And they see those images. They see them in the stained glass of our churches. You see them in the Christmas cards that get sent around every holiday season where baby Jesus is in the manger in what apparently is Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, rather than the other Bethlehem. Right? Lily white Jesus, which makes no sense anthropologically, biologically, historically, makes no sense at all. But our children see those images and it can affect them. Now, if you were to try to break into my house and hurt my children, I would kill you. Without hesitation. I don't even have a gun, but I would find something and I would throw it at you and you would die. Like, it's just that simple. I would make sure that you died, right? If you were to try to hurt my kids. I'm not saying that because I'm a badass. I'm just saying I'm just letting you know, don't mess with my children. But the problem, right? The problem is that there is something coming into that house. And it is hurting my children, and it's hurting all of our children, and it's hurting us, and I didn't even know it was there. See, the doors are locked at night, the windows are shut, the alarm is on, and whatever this thing is doesn't know the code, but the dirty little secret is it doesn't need to. It weasels its way into our children's brains and affects them. That's how I know that we've all ingested this poison, and we better own that if we're going to have an honest dialogue. It's not about feeling guilty about it. In fact, that's the beauty of it, right? If we've all been subjected to it, there's no reason to feel guilty, because we could not have helped but ingest it. The question is, what do we do now? How do we take responsibility, which is not the same as guilt? Responsibility is what you take because of the kind of person you are. Guilt is what you feel for the stuff you've actually done. Those are two different things. We take responsibility for things even when we're not to blame for them. So that's the first piece. The second piece, the systemic piece, right? Our inability or our lack of willingness to admit that there's also a systemic element to racism, that it's not just about personal prejudice. If it were, it'd be so much easier, right? Because we could just educate people out of their biases, right? And we could somehow undo their personal stuff and everything would be fine. But there's a bigger problem, and it's systemic. It's the way that policies and practices and everyday procedures reinforce inequality between different racial groups, even if there's no overt bigotry in the room. What do I mean by that? Let me tell you a story to make that point. And it's a story about my own life. I am from the South. I grew up in Nashville, Tennessee. I've lived in the South all my life, 10 years in New Orleans, the rest of it in Nashville. 5 months in Houston, but we don't talk about that. No offense to Houston, I'm just saying. Like, there are reasons, and we will not discuss them. So growing up in Nashville, I went to school in public schools at a time when they had really just become truly integrated. That may seem sort of hard to believe because theoretically, right, the Supreme Court outlawed segregation back in 1954, but as was the case in Nashville, so too was it the case all throughout the South, that very few school systems actually moved toward real desegregation for about 20 years. So it was 1974, the year that I started first grade, that the school system in Nashville was actually truly integrated all the way down to the first grade level. And so by 1979-80, my fifth grade year, right, there were a lot of teachers in that system that had been in there for a really long time. Like, they had been teaching since the days of segregation, and they were the kind of people that really preferred the days of segregation, right? So they didn't like having to teach black kids now, but what they really didn't like was having to teach white kids who hung out with black kids. And that was me. See, I told you before, most of the time when we say we have black friends, we're lying. In my case, I pretty much didn't have anything but black friends for the first several years of school because I went to preschool at a historically black college when I was 3 years old. Tennessee State University early childhood ed program. So most of my peers were black kids. So when I got into public school, that's who I was hanging out with. That's who I played ball with. That's who I played on the playground with. That's who I sat in the cafeteria with. And there were teachers who not only didn't like the black kids, but really didn't like me, particularly because of my affinities, both culturally, linguistically, and artistically with black folks. These are the early days of hip hop, and I was that kid. Like, I was the white kid that hung out with. We would have like rap battles, and I'm not gonna do that shit now because it would be tragic. But in those days, like 79, 80, you could be really bad at that in Nashville and you were still the best on the block, right? Because it was Nashville, it wasn't Brooklyn, it wasn't the Bronx, right? So the teachers really had a problem with who I hung out with and the music that I listened to and who my friends were. And there was one particular teacher, Mrs. Crownover, who was most offended by it. And so one day I get a report card, I have a D- in a reading class, which was what she taught, right? And my mom freaked out because reading was like the one thing I could do, right? If it was a math class, she would have totally not even blinked. She'd have been like, well, at least you didn't fail, you know. Good for you. You got it up from the F last time, you know. But in this particular case, I'd been reading since I was like 2.5, right? So she sort of freaks out. She schedules a parent-teacher conference. She goes to talk to Ms. Crownover. And within about 30, 45 seconds, she realizes that grade had nothing to do with my actual effort, let alone my attitude, let alone my ability to read. It had to do with my social circle because Ms. Crownover looks at my mom within the first minute of the meeting and says, any white parent that would send their kids to public school in this day and age, meaning an integrated day and age, obviously isn't fit to be a parent. They've lost their mind. This, by the way, is not what you want to say to my mother. So within a day or two, she organized with some other parents, and within 2 or 3 or 4 days, she had very directly and unceremoniously made sure that Mrs. Crownover was relieved of her income and her professional duties from there on out. She was forced into early retirement, as she should have been. So good for my mom. On the one hand, that's great. We got rid of the bigot. But remember, I told you it wasn't about individual bigots. It was about systems. And so here's the problem. Even as my mother took action, as she should have, to remove this racist from the classroom where she had no business teaching, right? But the problem was that after Ms. Crownover was gone, I went back into a school system that every day, in a very subtle but pernicious way, was sending the same kind of message that Mrs. Crownover was trying to send, which is white students are better, black students are lesser, and they shouldn't be together. How was the system sending that message? Very easy. By putting almost all the white kids in the honors and the advanced level classes, no matter what kind of students we were. I was a lousy student. I wasn't a good student till like last week. I literally got my shit together like Tuesday of last week, right? I wasn't a good student, but I was always in the honors track. And the black kids, no matter how bright they were almost always in the standard or the remedial level track and never moved up no matter how well they did. So the system was sending a message by dividing us and saying that it was division based on ability, but it wasn't. They were sending the message that Crownover was sending. They didn't even need her there to send it, you see. And my mother never saw that. And I never saw that. It went right over our heads. And that's not just a 1979 story. That continues to happen today. Right now in this country, students of color are half as likely to be placed in advanced placement and honors classes compared to white students. Students of color are half as likely to be taught by the most experienced teachers. White students twice as likely to have the most experienced teachers, right? Black and Latino students 2, 3, even 4 times more likely to be suspended or expelled, even though they do not break the rules more often than white students. That's the belief, but it's not true. There have been 14 different studies. They all find the same thing, that the rates of serious school rule infractions are virtually identical across racial lines. People bringing drugs to campus, equally across racial lines. People bringing weapons to campus, actually white men more likely to bring guns and knives to campus in K-12 schools than black men or Latino men. Contrary to popular belief, but that's what the Centers for Disease Control research says. But who is it that's getting caught? It's black kids and Latino kids. They're the ones getting searched. They're the ones getting detected. They're the ones getting suspended and often prosecuted, whereas white students are doing the same thing, doing drugs just as much, bringing weapons just as often, if not more so, and escaping notice. So that's still happening. That's a system, and it doesn't require one overt racist in the classroom for that to continue, right? So that becomes a problem. We have to do more than just look at the individual. We have to look at the way that structures operate, sometimes without us even realizing it's happening. Because if we don't do that, we can get rid of every individual bigoted cop or every individual bigoted teacher or any individual bigoted employer. We can sue them, I guess, in court, and maybe people can even win those lawsuits. But what does that really change unless we take aim at those institutional policies that keep recreating inequality? The third piece, our unwillingness to see how history affects the present, how the past and the present mix. We really don't like this. We really don't want to talk about this. And when I say we, I mean those of us called white especially. There are people of color who don't necessarily always want to engage it either, but especially those of us called white will say things like this when people of color bring up racism. We'll say, well, why can't you just get over it? You know, all of that slavery stuff was a long time ago. In fact, Louis C.K. has this really funny bit, right, where he jokes about how white people have just moved the date of slavery further and further and further back. Like it used to be, slavery was 100 years ago, because it was. And then it was, slavery was 125 years ago, because it was. And now it should be, slavery was 150 years ago, but we'll actually say things like, that was hundreds and hundreds, that was like 1,000 years ago, where we've not had slavery for 500 years. When in fact it's very much within the lifetime of people in this room's great-great-grandparents, even sometimes great-grandparents. And in fact, de facto slavery extended well past the Emancipation Proclamation. There were people of color being sent back into virtual enslavement all throughout the first 30 years of the 20th century, being made to work in the mines in places like Birmingham, coal mines there and elsewhere, going back to the very plantations from which their grandparents and great-grandparents had been emancipated, as sharecroppers, as tenant labor, tenant farmers, right? So in fact, slavery isn't that long ago. Segregation certainly isn't that long ago. But here's the point. We don't want to talk about it. And this is really funny that we want to tell black and brown folks to get over the past, because frankly, those of us who are white, we love the past. Absolutely flippin' love the past. How do I know that? Because some of us clearly want to go back to it. How do I know that? Because the Tea Party was a thing. And during that period when the Tea Party was a thing, you had a bunch of white folks go into rallies dressed in Revolutionary War costumes, carrying muskets and wearing powdered wigs. Okay, here's the thing. If you dress up in a Revolutionary War costume with a musket and a powdered wig, calling yourself the Tea Party, which I think is a really old-ass reference, you were in no position to lecture black people about getting over the past. That's all, right? Because by definition, you're still rocking like 1774. You got me? Right? But even now, right, we say things like, what is July 4th? Other than a reference to the past. Like, why do we still celebrate that? Independence Day, we broke away from the British a long ass time ago. That didn't happen last Friday. So why do we still set off fireworks every July 4th, right? I dare you to go up next Independence Day to like the most patriotic guy on the route, you know, with the red, white, and blue wardrobe, because that's an awesome wardrobe palette, and like a big I Heart the USA button on his hat, like flying a flag, blaring Lee Greenwood from the back of a pickup truck. I dare you to go up to that guy, tap him on the shoulder and say, yeah, this is all really nice, this is great, but when are you gonna get over it? Hope you have running shoes on, because he's going to chase you. Although he'll probably have had enough, slices of mom's apple pie that he won't be able to catch you. But my point being, we love the past as long as it makes us feel good about ourselves, right? When a current presidential candidate says he wants to make America great again, it's a reference to the past, right? It's a reference that says we want to go back to when things were great, but only great for certain people, because the time that's being remembered so fondly wasn't so great for everyone, right? So we love the past as long as it venerates us. We just don't want to deal with the ugly, but that's not how history works. You got to deal with the good and the bad and everything in between, right? And we know that, don't we? Like on a personal level, we know, like, put aside politics and race, just like you as individuals, right? We all come from families that are jacked up in one way or another, right? We all have dysfunction. We all have really messed up stuff in our families, some of which we talk about, a lot of which we never talk about, right? And the fact is, if you ever want, just as an individual, to move past your past, you have to confront it. Whether that's on a therapist's couch or whether that's with friends or a lover or a spouse or a partner, whatever it is, you've got to be willing to confront where you come from in order to get to the next place that's better. But we don't want to do that. We don't do that as individuals, and it eats us up. And we don't do that as a country, but we have to do that because the past affects the present. Inertia isn't just a property of the physical universe. It's also a property of the political and the economic universe. And here's how I know it's so important. Again, a story involving my own children about why it's so important that we know our history and are able to articulate that and the dangers of not knowing it. So, as it turns out, our daughters are both dancers. And a couple of years ago, when they were, let's say, 12 and a half, 10 and a half, I was driving them to dance one day after school. And in order to get to the studio where they were both dancing at that time, we had to drive from the school to the studio. It's about an 8-minute drive, and right in the middle of that drive is a public housing project. And so we're driving the route, we're right in between two sort of public housing developments, and we're there at the red light waiting for it to turn green. And the 10-and-a-half-year-old daughter, Rachel, she looks up and she says, Daddy, why is it that pretty much everybody in this neighborhood is black? Now that is an incredibly good anthropological and sociological inquiry. It's really very observant and a very important question. Now, the only reason she asked it, she probably noticed in many of our drives to the studio that we were driving through a virtually all black, and you could tell from the infrastructure, poor community. But that was the first day she asked about it. Not the first day she noticed it. I'm sure she'd noticed it. But that day she decided to inquire. And probably the only reason she even bothered was because she figured Daddy might know because Daddy talks about this stuff. So I'll ask him. Like if I was an accountant, she totally wouldn't have asked me that. She'd have been like, how do I do my taxes? I'd have been like, Google it, I don't know, TurboTax, something electronic, right? But she figured I might know, so she asked the question, why is this neighborhood pretty much all black? And her sister, of course, because this is what siblings do, right? Older siblings try to show off for the younger sibling, and so the older sister immediately jumps in to impress Daddy with the answer, which she somehow knew, or at least in part. She jumps in, she says, redlining, which oddly enough was true. And for those who don't know what redlining is, I'm about to explain, right? So it turns out that, in fact, in this country, the reason that people of color disproportionately live in lower income communities and urban areas is, in fact, because of this thing, among others, called redlining. And what that was that for generations, and it was perfectly legal to do this, by the way, up until 1968 when the Fair Housing Act passed. It went on for generations where you had banks that would take red markers on big maps in their offices, in the loan office of the bank, and they would draw lines around black neighborhoods, and occasionally Latino neighborhoods too, but especially black neighborhoods. And they would say anybody who lives within the boundaries of these lines cannot get a loan from the bank. You're not going to get a mortgage loan for a house. You're not going to get a business loan to start up your own business. Didn't matter what your credit record was, by the way. Didn't matter if you had a good job. Didn't matter what your occupational status or your education was. Simply living in that community meant you were not going to get a loan. So when my daughter says redlining is in part implicated, it wasn't the full picture, but it was a big piece of it. The bigger picture being a history of discrimination. Who could live where and who couldn't. And so I explained that to my daughter. The 10-year-old, of course, when her sister said redlining, she said, yeah, I don't know what that means. And I said, yeah, neither does your sister. She's just showing off. But I explained it. Took about 3 minutes, real simple little 3-minute discussion. Wasn't a long conversation, right? But it was enough to let her know that history matters, and that the things that she sees didn't just happen, that they're the result of certain policies. Because here's what's interesting about that area that we now like to call the ghetto. The reality is the ghetto was created, and public housing in particular was created not for poor black people. It was created for poor white people. And in fact, for the first several years of public housing, people of color couldn't even get into public housing projects. They were essentially segregated by race. Only poor white folks could even live there. And then what happened is the government created some new programs under the FHA program, the VA loan program, later on the GI Bill program, which allowed those same white folks who had been poor and struggling to leave public housing and to leave urban areas and to hustle it out to the suburbs where only we could live, or to the smaller towns where only we were going to be welcome. So what's interesting is that the hood became the hood because only people of color now were allowed to live there. White folks were literally being subsidized by the government to move to the suburbs. The white middle class, and make note of this, was built by government. Government programs that underwrote those loans because those families could not have afforded a loan otherwise. They were able to get one because the government underwrote the loan and guaranteed the loan in case of default, but only for people of color. Only for white folks. People of color, by and large, couldn't get in on any of that. So white folks were able to move, people of color were not. Certain neighborhoods deteriorated economically, other neighborhoods went up in value. At the very same time, the government was doing what they called urban renewal, which meant they came through black neighborhoods and Latino neighborhoods, and they built interstates right through the heart of the community, right? Knocking down black homes, black apartments, knocking down black-owned businesses all around the country. Between 1950 and 1970, about 1 in 5 apartments or houses lived in by black folks was knocked to the ground for economic development purposes, even though people of color couldn't benefit from almost any of that economic development. So that's how our communities come to look the way they look. But if we don't know that, and if I don't tell my daughter that, but maybe, let's say I don't tell her because I don't know. What if I don't know the history? What if I don't do this work and therefore don't know the answer? What do you think my daughter is going to assume is the answer? What would you assume is the answer? You know what we would assume if we're not taught the history? We would default to the position of this culture, which says what? Wherever you end up, it's all about you. So if you're living in a poor neighborhood, it's just because you didn't work hard enough. And if you live in an affluent neighborhood, it's obviously because you're smarter, right? The default position of America is this notion of rugged individualism and meritocracy, and wherever you end up is all about your own genius, your own effort, your own morality, your own cultural ethics. That's what we believe, and we believe that even though there is no such thing as a rugged individual in the history of human beings. How do I know that? Very simple. Human beings are social creatures by definition. We've never lived in isolation from one another. We've always lived in families and tribes and communities, nations, right? If you ever meet someone who's actually a rugged individual and hasn't been raised in a social context, you need to get the hell away from that person. They would be like a feral animal, right? They would be wild. It'd be like being raised on an island by a porpoise. They wouldn't even know how to have language. They'd probably try to eat you because they wouldn't understand there's like a taboo against that, right? You need to get the hell away from anybody who's actually a rugged individual because there are no such thing. And certainly, let me just say this, if you inherited $200 million from your daddy's real estate empire, you sure as hell are not a self-made anything or a rugged individual. You might want to write that shit down. So there is no rugged individual anything. We're all social beings. Some have had opportunity, others have not. Unless we're honest about that, unless we're willing to have a conversation, we end up misleading ourselves and we can't understand what we're seeing. And then if we can't understand it, we're not going to fix it, right? We're not going to fix the disparity in housing if we don't understand where it came from. So if the data says, and it does, that white folks on average have 15 times the net worth of black folks, 13 times the net worth of Latino folk, right? We just assume, well, we must have worked harder. Is that right? That's interesting because actually the black folks and brown folks have done some of the hardest work in this country ever since the country was founded. Were it not for the labor of African descended peoples, there would be no country at all. In fact, it was my family, white slave-owning family in the South that got black folks to do all the hard work because we were lazy asses and didn't want to work at all. White folks in the South on the plantation used to want to sit on the porch and drink mint juleps and have carriage rides rather than work, while black folks did all the real labor. And yet we decided that black folks are lazy, which I find fascinating. right? And then people write to me and say, well, these black people, they're just taking all the jobs. Okay, which is it, precious? Because it can't be both. People of color can't take all the jobs and be lazy. I don't ask much of racists because I expect very little. But you cannot be lazy and take all the jobs. Are we at least clear on that? Like, if you took all the jobs, you are like the opposite of lazy. If you are indeed lazy, you probably did not even take one job, let alone all of them. So I just need racists to get their damn story straight. That's all I ask. I just don't like moving targets. That's all, right? But if I don't tell my daughter the truth, she defaults to the position of the culture, and then she can't understand what the problem is. The same is true with policing. You can't understand the Black Lives Matter movement and the importance of it if you don't know the history and the relationship between law enforcement and black and brown peoples. If you understood that history, you wouldn't ask one question about why this movement is necessary and why it's righteous. If you knew that history, but you don't know it, and it's not your fault. You weren't supposed to know it, and nobody taught it to you, right? So you don't have to know that modern policing traces back to slave patrols. That black folks' first experience with law enforcement was having, you know who? Working class and poor white folks on horseback going around keeping black folks in line on behalf of the rich master that owned all the property. That sounds a lot like modern policing, because ain't no rich people policing, right? It's working class folks who are out there protecting the property of rich people against the depredations of poor people. That's what modern policing is, and it traces back. And we know that's what modern policing is, by the way, because we will lock you up for 10 years for $100 worth of food stamp fraud. But if you take $12.5 trillion on Wall Street, 20% of the net worth of this country, you will not do 1 day in jail. So we know that law enforcement has got nothing to do with enforcing the law. It's got nothing to do with good people and bad people, lawbreakers and the law abiding. It only has to do with controlling certain people. And black and brown folks know who those certain people usually are, because it's always been them. See, black folks know that it was cops who were involved in race riots and racial terrorism against black communities for the first 50 years of the 20th century. You didn't learn about that in class either, and that's not your fault. It wasn't taught. But in fact, every single year, just about from 1900 all the way to the 1930s, 1940s at least, there were race riots where white folks would just go into black communities, burn them to the ground, bomb them from the air like in Tulsa, Oklahoma, rip people out of their homes, beat them in the street, and police sat by, watched it happen, and participated. That doesn't mean that every cop in the modern era is like that, but it means that black folks can be excused for being not so clear on the decency of police in their communities because there's a history there. It was police who dragged black folks and white allies off of those sit-in stools at lunch counters in the South to enforce segregation. See, when your job is to enforce the law, and for most of American history the law was against you as a people, then enforcing the law means you are the first line of oppression. People of color know that history and need to be excused when they don't just get over it, because that continues. How do we know it continues? Very easy. We know from the data on racial profiling that black folks are twice as likely as white folks to be stopped and searched for drugs, even though white folks are more likely to have drugs on us on the occasions that we're searched. White folks use drugs and sell drugs at the same or higher rate than black folks and Latinos, and yet it is black folks and Latinos who in any given year make up 85 to 90% of the people who get arrested and incarcerated for a drug offense. See, people of color know that. And if we don't understand when black folks rise up and say Black Lives Matter. Well, what do you mean? All lives matter. Yes, sweetheart, I know they do. Yes, they do. And that is a totally irrelevant and unnecessary point to make. You see, you don't have to say all lives matter. We take that for granted. What we've never accepted in this country is that black and brown life matter. You have to proclaim that which is ignored, you see. That's why we have Black History Month right now and not White History Month. We don't have to have White History Month because we got May and June and July and August. And every other month where we learn about white folks, we don't have to call it that. See how slick that is? That's how white supremacy operates. You don't have to call it White History Month. You just call it history, and literature, and theater, and poetry, and art. You don't have to racialize where it came from, right? That's what Malefiasante at Temple calls universalizing the particular, which is the hallmark of Eurocentric thought, right? Not everybody's experience is the same. And so when certain people have been left out of all, you have to call that out by name. Because see, we've always said all, and we didn't mean it. We said all men are created equal, and we didn't mean that shit, right? We didn't mean women, but we didn't even mean all men. We said all, and it was a lie when we said it, right? And so in a sense, when you say Black Lives Matter, to respond with all lives matter would be like going in a time machine back to 1971. Y'all won't remember this, those who were students, those who were older will. Around 1970, 71, 72, the big phrase was black is beautiful, right? There was this desire to take back the beauty narrative from a beauty industry, fashion industry, glamour industry that had hijacked it and denigrated black physicality and beauty, right? So folks were saying black is beautiful to reclaim a sense of beauty for themselves. It'd be like getting in a time machine, going back to 1971, hearing somebody say black is beautiful and tapping them on the shoulder and going, but we're all beautiful in our own way. Yes, shut up, we know. Not the point. It'd be like going back to the early 80s when the HIV/AIDS crisis started. And it took several years for the president of the United States to even utter the word. Ronald Reagan didn't want to even utter the word, let alone cut loose with funding to deal with the problem until his buddy Rock Hudson died of it. And then all of a sudden, he was willing to talk about it a little bit, right? So for the first several years, what'd you have? You had activists out in the street. You had ACT UP, Gay Men's Health Crisis, out in the street demanding research and funding for HIV/AIDS, right? And what they were saying, in effect, was people with AIDS lives matter. That wasn't the actual phrase, and we didn't have hashtags, but that was essentially what they were saying, right? People with AIDS lives matter, and we need to pay attention because right now we're not paying attention to that. And we don't seem to believe it as a society, so we need to start believing it. It would be like getting in a time machine, going back to 1983, 82, in the middle of an ACT UP event or a Gay Men's Health Crisis event and shutting down the protest by saying, yeah, but what about pancreatic cancer? People die of all kinds of things, right? Sort of not the point. You have to proclaim that which is ignored. And if we know the history, we understand that, right? Because if we know the history, we know that it is indeed black life, and I would suggest brown life, life of color generally, indigenous life, that is usually denigrated, demeaned, ignored. On a sexual level, it's trans lives that are demeaned, ignored, right? It's women as women. So sometimes you got to proclaim that which is not in the obvious frame of reference. There's nothing pernicious about it. It's not about saying black lives are worth more than other lives. It's about, damn it, these lives actually do matter. And even though the history says they don't, we're here to tell you that they do. And there's nothing wrong about that at all. But if you don't know the history, it might seem untoward. And I get it. And again, it's not your fault that you don't know the history, but it is our responsibility to learn it and then apply it to what we see. Same is true with immigration. This immigration drama that we have right now is only possible because we don't understand our own history. As a country, and particularly those of us of European descent, we have lied to ourselves about how we got here and for what reason. See, black folks know why they're here. Native peoples know why they're here and how they got here. A lot of Asian folk know, particularly if they're Chinese American, they know they got here because their ancestors were brought over to work on the railroads by the railroad barons who didn't care if thousands of them died laying track 19, 20 hours a day. But for those of us who are from Europe, we have this fiction that we've told, and we believe it, even though there's no truth to it. You know what the fiction is? It's two parts. Number one, we say things like, with regard to Mexicans coming over the border, with regard to immigrants coming up, but only that border. That's the only one we care about, right? The southern border. I find that interesting. We're not flipping out about Canada, right? We don't have any of the Minutemen or the anti-immigrant groups sitting off the coast of Nova Scotia with a gun and a scope trying to like pick off the sneaky Canadians that are trying to sneak in here for our superior healthcare system, which after all would be a pretty stupid thing to do. But in any event, we only care about that one border, forgetting for a minute that that border was created at the end of a war that was started on false pretense by this country, after which we jacked half of their country. And you weren't taught that in school either because our history books aren't interested in telling the truth. They tell this very patriotic history that has no relationship to the fact. So that border is artificial. Mexican folk who are coming here, documented or not, let's be clear, are coming home. Their families were here before our families were here in almost every instance. But we forget that, and then we say things like, well, I don't mind them coming. I just want them to come legally like my people did. The hell does that even mean? Come legally? There was no law to break when our people came. The fact that we didn't break a law that didn't even exist, you don't get cookies for that. You don't get like a pat on the back and a gold star because your great, great, great whatever was law-abiding when there was no law that he could have violated, even if he wanted to. But we've told this lie that we came for these upstanding principles. So we'll say things like, well, you know, our people came for liberty and freedom, democracy. These people are just coming for stuff. They're just coming for jobs. They're just coming for health care. They're just coming for stuff. We came for high-minded principle, right? Because we believe that. What kind of third-grade version of American history is that, right? Like when Donald Trump says, well, Mexico's not sending their best. What the hell, you think Europe sent their best? Europe, no, our people were the losers of Europe. I'm not trying to be an asshole, I'm just telling you the truth. Like, our people were the losers of Europe. The winners didn't get on the boat. You understand what I'm saying? The winners didn't leave. Why the hell would you leave if you were winning? Only the losers left because they had no choice. They were dying, they were starving, they couldn't support their families. A lot of them were convicts who were sold into indentured servitude to work for rich European people. They were barely above the level of a slave themselves. The idea that we had we didn't believe in liberty and freedom. And we know that because once we got to the colonies, we set up the opposite of liberty and freedom. And I don't just mean that for like black folks and native folks. I mean even for other white folks. Like we spent most of the time in the early colonies trying to figure out who the witch was, right? It was like, well, you're not a Christian. Well, no, you're not a Christian. Well, no, you're not a Christian. I'm going to hang you from a tree. Really? Well, I'm going to drown you in the stream. Well, I'm going to set you on fire. Like, that wasn't liberty. The colonies were some of the least free places in the history of the cosmos. But we act like we came for liberty, and they're just here to take advantage. Let's be clear. Our people didn't come for liberty. They came for stuff. They came for stuff like land. They came for stuff like opportunity. They came for stuff like the ability to feed their families, and there's no shame in that. None at all. But just like there's no shame in our families having done that, there's no shame in brown families doing that and coming over that border from Mexico, Central America, or wherever else they might be coming. There's no shame in any event, but we've told a lie. It's like we have this image in our head that sometime in like 1650, this was a common scene in England. All the nice white noblemen got together, and one of them gathered his children around the fireplace in the middle of the 1600s and said, well, now, children, I think you'll agree with me that we're doing quite brilliant here, and we have this big mansion, and we have all this gold, and you remember last week when the king invited us to the palace, and you played out in the garden with his children. I know, it was brilliant, right? It was great, it was great, it was great. I bet it was lots of fun, but Daddy thinks that we need to stop all that nonsense and maybe strike out on an adventure, so here's my plan. Even though we're doing so well, even though we pretty much run the show here in England, I think that what we should do this summer, follow me, stick with me, I know it's going to be a stretch, but I promise it's going to be great, is we should get on a big boat. A rickety old ship. I don't even know if it's seaworthy, children. It might sink. We might be eaten by sharks. We might get hijacked by pirates. We might get scurvy and die a horrible death. However, I think you will agree it will be an adventure, a great one indeed. That did not happen. Noblemen didn't leave. Those who were doing well did not leave. Only the losers got on the boat. People say things like, well, my family came over on the Mayflower. Okay, sweetheart, you might not want to talk about that. If you actually knew who was on those early ships, I'm not sure who was, but I know who wasn't. The king. The king was not on that ship. Nobody the king really wanted to keep around was on that ship, right? So our inability to see this, though, understand the importance historically. If we don't understand that we came for the same reasons that folks come today, be they documented or not, then we can't see them in us, and we can't see us in them. And that's why we have this drama, because we're spending all this time pretending that our motivations and our even human decency and ethics are different when they're not, you see. This is why history matters so much. We can't fix any of these problems, whether it's immigration issues, whether it's criminal justice issues, whether it's wealth disparity, all of that. We can't do anything about that if we're not willing to understand history. But let me close with this. And it's a point that I think needs to be made, because sometimes when we talk about racism and we talk about the heavy weight of history, sometimes people assume that there is an attempt on my part or other anti-racist activists or educators' part to instill guilt in white people. I have no interest in white guilt, none. And people of color surely have no interest in white guilt. Guilt will not liberate anybody from anything. It will not liberate any of us from systems of inequality. It isn't about feeling guilty. It's not even about white people per se. It's about whiteness as a system, right? Sometimes people get tripped up on that, right? And they think like, oh, you hate white people. Actually, let me be clear, I love me some white people. I totally, absolutely love me some white people. Like, my wife is white. I totally love her. Those daughters that I've been telling you about, they're white, because that's what happens when white people make babies. I love them. My mom, love her, nice white lady. And my dad and I don't get along, but it's not because he's white. It's about some other shit that we don't have time to process tonight. But if you read my book, White Like Me, you'll know what some of that is. We don't have to talk about that. It's not about white people. It's about whiteness. It's about a system of white supremacy that has turned us against one another, right? And so I want to tell you a story that tries to explain the difference between guilt and responsibility so you'll know what I mean when I say those things are different, because it's one thing to say that, it's another thing to really understand why. So let me just share a brief story with you, and then I'll take questions, and I'll let you out of here, and I'll be happy to sell you some books if you want one, because I got a college fund to pay for. So, feel free to come buy some merchandise. But anyway, the story is not about racism, so that part of the speech is over, right? It's not about oppression. It's not about privilege. It's not about inequality. It's about something totally different. But I think the story has a lesson in it about those subjects. So it has to do with something that happened to me when I got out of college. I graduated 26 years ago this May from Tulane University in New Orleans. And when I graduated, for some reason, I'm still not totally clear on this, I thought it would be a really great idea to move into a very large house with 9 other people. Let me just give you a little life advice, all right? Like, if you haven't already figured this out, okay, do not think for 1 minute that it is ever a good idea to move into a very large house with 9 other people. It usually is not nearly as fun as you think it is going to be. It has all kinds of problems, but we didn't think about any of those. We thought it was going to be great. Why? Because it was going to be cheap. And we needed that because we were broke, right? We were right out of college. We didn't have any money. Rent was $525 a month. I don't mean per person, I mean total, right? So again, not good at math, but I can do those numbers. $52.50 per person per month, man. You add the cable bill, the utility bills, we split the food, right? It's still less than $100 a month. So like on that level, this was a great idea, right? This was brilliant, right? $100 a month, man. Even in $1990, that was good, right? It'd be ridiculous today, but it would be good even by 1990 standards. So on a financial level, it made sense. But about 6 weeks into this little experiment in communal living, we came to understand, or at least I did, why it had been a terrible mistake. And this is what happened. I was working downtown and I was living uptown. So I get on the streetcar to come back uptown in New Orleans. I get off the streetcar, I walk, 5 blocks or so into the house on Robert Street. I go up the steps at 1805 Robert. I open the door and I'm met by this incredible smell. And I mean that in a good way, which is important to point out, because when you live with 9 other people, there's all kinds of smells. They're usually not good. This one was actually really nice. It was the smell of dinner being cooked for the whole group, because we also took turns making dinner for each other. And this particular night, one of my roommates was making dinner. On the left front burner of the stove, there was this big pot of gumbo, right? And man, that's what you do in New Orleans. Big pot of gumbo, and it smelled good, and it looked good, and it even had shrimp in there. Not many, like I said, we were broke, but it had like 3. 3 of those really little bitty ass shrimp, those shrimp that are like so small, right, that they make jumbo shrimp look like lobsters or something, right? And so I looked at it and I smelled it and I thought, man, that looks great. And when my roommate asked me if I wanted any, I normally would have said yes, but as it turned out, I didn't know he was going to make gumbo for the night. And so I'd already had dinner downtown before I, came uptown after I got off work. So I said, hey man, I already ate, but do me a favor, smells great, looks great. Take me some of that, put it in a container, put it in the fridge. I'm gonna take it to work tomorrow for lunch. And he said, okay, great. And so he does that, and then I go upstairs and, listen to music, watch TV, hung out with some friends or whatever, and did whatever we did for fun in 1990. There wasn't much. Like social networking in 1990 was pretty much you just walk down the hall to your roommate's room and you're like, hey, what you doing? And they were like, nothing, it's 1990, there's nothing to do, go back to sleep. Get with us in like 15 years and there will be something maybe, or 20 years, right? So we all sort of go to bed early. I went to bed sort of early, woke up the next morning at like 7:30, came downstairs to get some coffee, get ready to go to work, and I noticed that on the left front burner of our stove was still the same pot of gumbo. And man, it did not smell as good or look as good as it had the night before. And my roommate had neither saved any of it for me, nor had he cleaned it. So I was pissed on 2 levels, right? Now the food had gone to waste. I definitely wasn't going to eat it now. But he also left the mess for me or, maybe one of the other roommates to clean. So I sat there and I thought about what I wanted to do. Part of me wanted to wake him up, right? Get him to clean it, give him hell for it. But then I thought, no, I'm going to be nice. I'm just going to clean it. I'll take it up with him when I get home. So I took the pot of gumbo and I brought it over to the sink and I got the brush and the soap and I started running the water into the pot of nasty day-old gumbo, and I stopped myself halfway through. And I said, man, I don't have to clean this. This isn't my mess. I didn't even eat any of this, let alone did I make it. So now I'm feeling really self-righteous because I'm talking myself out of doing the hard work, right? So now I feel real smart. So I take the pot of gumbo and I put it right back where I found it on the left front burner, right? And I walk out the door, head held high, knowing that I had not been suckered into cleaning somebody else's mess, right? So then I come back that night at about 6:15, 6:30, and I see one of my other roommates making dinner on the right front burner of the stove. But on the left front burner, right where it had been now for 24 hours, is the same pot of gumbo, getting nastier, more disgusting, more crusted on the sides of the pot. I looked at my roommate, I'm like, man, what are you doing? Like, I know you can smell dinner from last night. How the hell can you make dinner for us now on the right front burner when it's right under your nose? Why don't you clean that? And he looked at me and said, hey man, I didn't make the gumbo. I didn't even eat any of the gumbo. I wasn't even here last night. How about you? I said, hey man, not me. Now we both felt self-righteous and we knew what it meant. He looked at me and said, so, you want some lentils and rice? And I said, absolutely. So I piled up my plate with lentils and rice. I ate my dinner. I wiped off the dish in the sink, cleaned it, dried it, put it in the dish rack, went upstairs, hung out with the roommates, did whatever we do for fun in 1990. Once again, went to bed sort of early. Woke up the next morning. I'd forgotten to set an alarm. Wake up about 7. But here's a tip. If you're living in a house where a pot of gumbo has been sitting on the left front burner of the stove for what is now 36 and a half hours, you are not going to need an alarm clock to wake your ass up. You are going to be awake, right? Because the smell is going to find you. It is going to crawl out of the pot of gumbo on the legs that it grew overnight. And I'm not speaking in metaphor, English majors. I mean that shit literally. Like the stink is gonna grow feet and legs, and it is going to crawl out of the pot, across the kitchen, across the living room, up the stairs, down the back hall, go under your door frame, and it is going to find with the precision of a laser that thing on the front of your face you call a nose, and you will be awake. And now I was pissed because I knew what the smell meant, right? I knew what was waiting for me on the left front burner, having not been cleaned by anybody, least of all the guy that made the gumbo. So I open my door real loud. I start stomping down the hall, hoping to wake people up, hoping to let them know just how displeased I am. Live with 9 other people, cannot find one of them. And the guy that made the gumbo's like, where's Waldo? Nobody knows where in the hell he went. He just made the gumbo like a practical joke and disappeared, right? Just wanted to see how long it would take for somebody else to clean up his mess, I guess. And I get down to the bottom of the stairs. I look across the living room into the kitchen. I see the pot of gumbo, and I'm pretty confident the gumbo saw me, right? With the eyes that it had also grown. It was evolving right there in our kitchen very rapidly, yes? And it was at that moment, not one moment earlier, but definitely not a moment later, that I came to understand maybe the most important lesson I'd ever learned about any subject. And what was it? The lesson was it didn't really matter anymore who made the mess. Didn't really matter anymore who was the author of all this unpleasantness, as the old saying goes. The only thing that mattered was that I was tired of living in that nastiness. I was tired of living with the residue of somebody else's actions. I was not to blame, but I had to take responsibility, because if I didn't, it may not get clean. You see, and the same is true with human society. When we decide that we will clean up the residue of what other folks left us, even though they did it without our permission and without our involvement, when we decide that we're tired of living in that, we will clean it. Not because we are to blame, not because we are guilty, but because we're the only damn ones left. Thank you all so much for being here. I appreciate your time.